We stand united, no matter the whispers.
Together, always.
This is scandalous!
The scandal was orchestrated with nothing more than a quill, a pot of black ink, and a woman the court deemed entirely too plain to notice. If you love uncovering the forgotten histories where silent resilience shatters arrogant power, consider subscribing to the channel and walking this journey with me to the very end. The truth of what truly happened beneath those crystal chandeliers is a masterclass in survival, and it begins not with a crown, but with the dirt. There is a distinct scent to dying earth. It smells like cracked dust, brittle roots, and quiet desperation. Eve Lawson knew that scent intimately, even though she lived within the towering stone walls of Ethelred Castle, a place suffocated by the heavy, cloying stench of imported rosewater, roasted game, and the powdered wigs of the elite. The glittering nobility that drifted through the palace corridors lived in a state of willful delusion, completely oblivious to a profound, unforgiving historical truth. A kingdom built on gold will inevitably starve if no one understands the soil beneath its feet. To the lords and ladies of Ethelred, Eve was entirely invisible. She possessed no dowry, held no sweeping titles, and wore no jewels at her throat. She was a ward, bound in unyielding servitude to House Thorn, governed by her guardian, the vain and venomous Lady Rowena. While Rowena spent her days draped in imported emerald silks, obsessing over court gossip and the exact placement of her beauty marks, Eve existed in the cold shadows. She was the hidden architect of Rowena's comfortable life, tasked with managing the grueling, labyrinthine estate ledgers and the increasingly desperate agricultural challenges of their lands. Eve's hands were often stained with dark ink or rich loam. Rowena's were soft, manicured, and exceptionally good at taking credit. But the comfortable delusions of the court were suddenly shattered by a looming threat. Famine was creeping across the realm, biting hardest in the north. Enter Bradley Stevens, the formidable Duke of the Northern Reaches. Bradley was a man forged in the harsh realities of governance and survival. He arrived at the king's court carrying the immense weight of a dying province on his broad, velvet-clad shoulders. His people were hungry, his fields were turning to ash, and he was rapidly running out of time. He had not traveled to Ethelred to find a decorative porcelain bride to hang on his arm like a trophy. He was hunting for a true partner, a woman capable of statecraft, sharp intellect, and absolute endurance. Lady Rowena, whose ambition vastly outweighed her intellect, immediately set her sights on the Duke's wealth and title. To snare the most powerful bachelor in the kingdom, she initiated a formal correspondence, presenting herself as a woman of profound substance and political acumen. But Rowena could barely comprehend a simple household ledger, let alone the complexities of agricultural preservation. The true author of the letters was, of course, Eve. Under Rowena's strict, dismissive command, Eve drafted the missives late into the night by the light of a single, sputtering tallow candle. But what began as a forced duty quickly transformed into a secret, desperate rebellion. Starved for intellectual connection and genuinely terrified for the commoners of the north, Eve poured her hidden, brilliant genius into the parchment. She wrote of revolutionary, untested ideas, complex crop rotation cycles, the delicate chemistry of soil restoration, and the forgotten methods of wresting the land. Miles away, Bradley opened these letters and found himself utterly captivated. He had expected the shallow flatteries of a desperate courtier. Instead, he found the fierce, brilliant mind of a visionary. He wrote back, his replies filled with a rigorous intellect and a surprising, gentle curiosity that made Eve's breath catch in her throat. For the first time in her 22 years, Eve felt truly seen. Saturday in the freezing dark of her quarters, tracing the Duke's masculine, sweeping script with her fingertips, she wasn't the plain, impoverished ward of House Thorn. In those letters, she was his equal, a savior, a queen of the earth. He fell deeply in love with the soul inked onto the page, entirely unaware that the Lady Rowena he was writing to was nothing but a beautiful, vacuous mask hiding a fiercely intelligent, plain-clothed ward. Then came the crisp autumn afternoon. The heavy iron gates of Ethelred Castle groaned open. The blare of the royal trumpets echoed through the courtyards, signalling the Duke's arrival. From the high, shadowed arches of the servants' gallery, Eve looked down into the bustling courtyard. She watched as Bradley Stevens dismounted his massive warhorse, his dark blue velvet coat cutting a striking figure against the grey stone. His intense eyes immediately began scanning the welcoming party for the brilliant woman he had crossed a kingdom to meet. Down below, Lady Rowena stood preening, her lips painted, her black lace fan fluttering, completely unprepared for the intellectual interrogation that was about to come. Eve stepped deeper into the shadows, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The letters had brought the Duke to the castle, but the deception was now sealed within its walls. The real test had finally arrived, and Eve knew with chilling certainty that her brilliant, carefully chosen words were about to be spoken by a woman who didn't understand a single one of them. The great hall of Ethelred Castle was a monument to excess, dripping with gold leaf and echoing with the hollow laughter of the elite. Yet, as Bradley Stevens stood before Lady Rowena of House Thorn, he felt a sudden, freezing sense of isolation. The visual contrast between them was jarring. Bradley wore a dark, pragmatic military coat, unadorned save for his ancestral signet ring, his posture forged by years of commanding men through bitter winters. Rowena, however, was a blinding spectacle of vanity. She was dripping in crushed velvet and heavy rubies, her face painted into a flawless porcelain mask of aristocratic perfection. Determined to find the brilliant strategist he had fallen for on parchment, Bradley bypassed the standard court pleasantries. He leaned in, his voice a low, urgent rumble, and asked about the sulfur treatments for winter wheat they had discussed in their third letter. Rowena's painted smile froze. A flicker of sheer panic crossed her eyes before she expertly hid it behind the rapid fluttering of her black lace fan. She offered a high, tinkling laugh, gently tapped his arm with her fan, and seamlessly deflected the question, loudly changing the subject to the scandalous new fashions arriving from the eastern courts. Bradley stood rigid. He watched her giggle, a terrible, sinking realization settling in his chest. Where was the fierce intellect? Where was the woman who understood the fragile chemistry of survival? Watching from the shadowed periphery of the hall, her hands tightly clasped, Eve Lawson knew exactly why Lady Rowena was faltering. 3 nights prior, under the flickering light of a dying candle, Eve had enacted a quiet, desperate rebellion. Rowena had tossed a blank sheet of parchment onto Eve's desk, demanding she write something clever to keep the northern brute's attention. Exhausted by the theft of her mind and deeply resentful of Rowena's cruelty, Eve decided to lay a trap. She did not use poison or blades, she used academia. Drawing from a decaying, forgotten tome she had unearthed in the deepest, dustiest corner of the palace archives, Eve wove a highly complex, obscure historical reference into the letter. She proposed adapting ancient Roman agricultural steppe terracing, a meticulous method of cutting flat platforms into steep mountain gradients to prevent topsoil erosion, to save the Duke's failing northern slopes. It was a concept so advanced, only a true scholar of the earth would comprehend it. The trap snapped shut during the welcoming banquet that evening. The tables groaned under the weight of roasted swans and spun sugar, but Bradley had lost his appetite entirely. Desperate to salvage the illusion of the woman he loved, he turned to Rowena amidst the clatter of silver goblets. "Your latest thoughts on the Roman terracing methodologies for my mountain borders were nothing short of revolutionary, my lady," Bradley prompted, his intense gaze locking onto hers. "Tell me, how would you calculate the drainage gradients?" Rowena blinked, her smile vacuous and bright. "Oh, the terraces," she exclaimed, entirely misinterpreting the word. "Yes, Your Grace, I do so love a grand terrace. We must absolutely build wider ones at your northern estate. perhaps with sweeping marble balustrades and gilded arches for the summer balls. The musicians could play from above. The temperature at the table seemed to drop 10 degrees. Bradley's eyes turned instantly cold, the final shred of his hope turning to ash. Marble balustrades. The woman sitting beside him was a spectacularly dressed fraud. The fan fluttered, the jewels sparkled, but the illusion was dead. He realized instantly that he had been utterly deceived. The author of those letters, the visionary who held the key to his people's survival, was a phantom, hiding somewhere within the stone walls of this very fortress. By dawn, Bradley was awake, pacing the frost-bitten courtyards of the castle. His mind was a storm of frustration and betrayal. He wandered far from the opulent guest wings, finding himself near the working royal glasshouses and the damp, overturned soil of the estate's gardens. It was there he heard a voice. It was soft, yet possessed a firm, undeniable authority, entirely lacking the affected, breathy lilt of the nobility. Bradley stepped silently behind a thick stone pillar. A few yards away, kneeling directly in the damp, freezing dirt, was the painfully plain, unadorned ward he had briefly noticed in Rowena's shadow. Eve was dressed in dull, practical linen, her dark hair pulled back severely. An elderly, frantic head gardener stood over her as she expertly examined the roots of a dying, rare rosebush. "It isn't a lack of water, Thomas," Eve instructed, her fingers gently rubbing the soil, entirely unbothered by the grime staining her skin. "Look at the yellowing veining on the lower foliage. It is severe chlorosis. The soil here is far too alkaline, and it is binding the iron so the roots cannot feed. You need to turn the earth and mix in acidic pine needles and sulfur ash immediately, or the entire root system will suffocate by the next moon." Bradley froze, his breath catching in the crisp morning air. Chlorosis, alkaline, root systems, sulfur ash. He listened to the unmistakable cadence of her voice, the depth of her knowledge, and the fierce, protective passion she held for living things. It was the exact voice from the letters. Bradley stared at the smudge of dark earth on her pale cheek, the absolute lack of jewelry, the severe plainness of her gown, and the undeniable, blinding brilliance in her eyes. The truth hit him like a physical blow to the chest, stealing the air from his lungs. The architect of his realm's salvation, the brilliant mind he had fallen desperately in love with, wasn't seated at the high table in silk and rubies. She was the invisible girl, kneeling right here in the dirt. The announcement of the king's grand ball sent a feverish tremor through Ethelred Castle, transforming the corridors into a chaotic blur of imported silks and frantic seamstresses. But amidst the glittering preparations, Lady Rowena's vanity was curdling into sharp, paranoid jealousy. She had not missed the subtle shift in Bradley Stevens. She noticed how the Duke's piercing gaze would slide right past her diamond-adorned neckline, searching the shadowed arches and the dusty corners of the library where her plain, invisible ward quietly worked. Determined to brutally sever any lingering fascination the Duke might have with the servant girl, Rowena orchestrated a masterstroke of social humiliation. She commanded Eve's attendants at the ball to manage her train, but issued a cruel decree. Eve was forbidden from wearing any of the palace's fine fabrics or borrowed jewels. Instead, Rowena forced her into an archaic, severely cut, unadorned green gown. Rowena intended to parade Eve beneath the blinding crystal chandeliers as a stark, pathetic contrast to her own radiant beauty. A common peasant girl drowning in a sea of elite perfection. As Eve dressed in the freezing isolation of her quarters, she smoothed the heavy, matte fabric down her sides. What the vacuous court failed to understand was the profound history woven into the very threads of the garment. The dress was not dyed with the bright, festive emeralds or garish chartreuse favored by the nobility. It was verdigris. The dye was a brutal, arduous creation, born from oxidized copper steeped in fermented wine casks and sealed beneath the earth. For centuries, Verdigris had been the sacred color of the ancient healer guilds, the men and women who had stood in the blood and mud of history, pulling kings back from the brink of death. To the shallow, powdered faces of the Ethelred court, the dark, muted green looked severely plain, almost militaristic. But to a military tactician and historian like Bradley, it was a color that commanded absolute reverence. It was the color of endurance, of survival, of true, undeniable nobility. When Eve finally stepped into the periphery of the grand hall, the cruelty of the court was immediate. Tittering laughs rippled through the sea of pastel ball gowns. Lace fans snapped open to hide cruel whispers. Look at her, too plain for the palace, a weed among the roses. The mocking whispers clung to her skin, thick and suffocating. Unable to bear the crushing weight of their collective disdain, Eve slipped through a side door and fled into the night. She sought refuge in the only place that made sense, the royal glass house. It was a suffocatingly humid sanctuary of exotic vines and damp earth, a stark contrast to the cold marble of the ball. Eve leaned against a heavy wooden planting table, squeezing her eyes shut, trying to steady her ragged breathing. Then, the heavy glass door clicked shut behind her. Eve spun around. Bradley Stevens stood blocking the exit, his broad shoulders framing the moonlight. He had followed her. Without a word, he closed the distance between them, cornering her against the dense canopy of hanging orchids and creeping ivy. The air grew impossibly thick. "It was you," Bradley said. His voice was a low, rough whisper that sent a shiver straight down her spine. The sulfur ash, the alkaline roots, the Roman terraces. It was never Rowena. Eve backed away, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs, terrified of what this discovery meant. "You do not know what you are saying, Your Grace. I am a ward. I manage ledgers. I know nothing of—" "Do not lie to me." Bradley stepped closer, stripping away the last remnants of his composed, ducal armor. His eyes were blazing with a mixture of awe and desperate relief. "You are the mind that can save my people. Why do you hide behind her?" "Because I must," Eve fired back, her own armor finally shattering. Her voice trembled with years of suppressed rage and crushing fear. "Look at me. I am a low-born ward. Do you know what this court does to women like me who possess an intellect greater than their masters? They do not call it genius, Your Grace. They call it unnatural ambition. They call it witchcraft. It is a death sentence. My plainness, my silence, it is my only shield against a venomous world." Bradley stopped. He looked at the fierce, brilliant woman trembling in the verdigris gown. He saw the smudge of ink on her knuckles. He saw the raw, untamed power in her eyes. He didn't see a peasant to be pitied. He saw a sovereign of the earth. He saw his equal. "You will never need to hide from me," Bradley murmured, his voice dropping to a gravelly vow. He reached out, his large, calloused hands gently framing her face, and he kissed her. It was not a polite, courtly gesture. It was a profound, desperate collision of two minds and souls that had finally found their harbor in the dark. Eve gasped, her hands tangling in the rich velvet of his coat, kissing him back with all the suppressed fire she had buried for years. When they finally broke apart, breathless in the humid shadows, Bradley reached for his right hand. He slid the heavy, ancestral gold ducal signet ring from his finger, the absolute symbol of his northern power. Gently, deliberately, he took Eve's trembling hand and pressed the warm gold deep into her palm, folding her fingers over it. "Keep it hidden," he whispered fiercely against her forehead. "It is a promise. When the time comes, Eve, I will tear this palace to the ground before I let them touch you." Eve slipped back into the blinding brilliance of the grand hall, her heart still hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. Before returning to her station behind Lady Rowena's gilded chair, she had sprinted up the spiraling, draughty servants' stairs to her freezing, austere quarters. There, with trembling hands, she had buried Bradley's heavy gold signet ring deep at the bottom of her wooden mending box. She was terrified that carrying such a powerful, heavy artifact on her person might accidentally betray their secret to the predatory eyes of the court. Back in the hall, the mockery resumed the exact moment the candlelight hit her verdigris gown. The glittering elite of Ethelred twirled past her in bursts of lilac silk and spun gold, their whispers drifting toward her like toxic smoke. Look at her, standing there like a bruised reed. Too plain for the palace. Lady Rowena must keep her around simply to make her own beauty look brighter. But Eve no longer felt the sharp sting of their venom. Her skin still hummed with the phantom warmth of Bradley's touch, and when she dared to lift her gaze across the crowded room, she found his. Bradley Stevens stood against the vast expanse of the marble pillars, completely ignoring the flock of high-born ladies attempting to draw him into empty conversation. He held a crystal goblet of wine, but his piercing eyes were locked solely on Eve. To him, the severe, dark green of her gown was not plain. It was a battle standard. It was the mark of a queen who knew the earth, standing amidst a sea of fragile, useless ornaments. The silent conversation passing between them was so intense, so heavily laden with a dangerous promise, it practically hummed in the stifling air. From her seat of honor, Lady Rowena saw it all. Rowena's painted smile tightened into a brittle, terrifying line. Her knuckles turned stark white as she gripped her black lace fan. She watched the Duke, the man destined to elevate her to the highest echelons of royal power, stare at her invisible, dirt-smudged ward with a look of absolute, unapologetic reverence. Panic, sharp and metallic, clawed at Rowena's throat. She was losing her ultimate prize to a peasant. The realization twisted her vanity into a lethal, venomous rage. A simple dismissal from service would no longer suffice. Eve Lawson needed to be eradicated permanently. Slipping away from the high table under the guise of powdering her nose, Rowena moved swiftly through the shadowed corridors. As the head of the household, she possessed the iron master key to every servant's quarters in the wing. She invaded Eve's tiny, freezing room, her heavy silk skirts dragging across the bare stone floor. Rowena tore through the girl's meager belongings with frantic malice, ripping the thin mattress, upending the ceramic wash basin, and finally shattering the small wooden mending box against the wall. Out rolled the heavy, ancestral gold signet ring of the northern reaches. Rowena gasped, her eyes widening as she snatched it from the floorboards. She recognized the crest immediately. How the wretched girl had acquired it did not matter to her. What mattered was the medieval law forged in blood. To steal the signet ring of a ruling duke was an act of high treason, a crime equated with trying to steal the duke's identity, his lands, and his army. The punishment was absolute, brutal exile or the executioner's block. A wicked, triumphant smile curled onto Rowena's lips. She had found the weapon that would sever Eve's head from her shoulders. Down in the grand hall, the orchestra was swelling into the final, triumphant waltz of the evening. Suddenly, a sharp, piercing shriek tore through the melody. "Guards! Treason! Halt the music!" The cellos shrieked to a discordant, jarring halt. The dancers froze, parting like the Red Sea, as Lady Rowena stormed into the center of the hall, flanked by 3 armed palace guards. Her chest heaved with theatrical horror, tears of faux betrayal glistening perfectly on her cheeks. "Forgive me, Your Majesty," Rowena cried out, bowing deeply toward King Alden's throne, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "But I have uncovered a viper in our very nest." She thrust her hand into the air. Pinched between her manicured fingers, glinting damningly under the 1,000 crystal prisms of the chandelier, was Bradley's gold signet ring. "I caught my ward hoarding this in her chambers," Rowena screamed, leveling a trembling finger directly at Eve. "She has stolen the Duke's royal seal. High treason!" A collective, suffocating gasp erupted from the hundreds of nobles. The whispers instantly morphed into a roar of scandalized outrage. Eyes darted from the heavy gold ring to the pale, plain girl standing frozen in her verdigris gown. In a medieval court, theft of a signet was a definitive, unforgivable end. King Alden rose slowly from his throne, his face darkening with absolute royal fury. He slammed his golden scepter against the marble dais. "Seize her!" the king thundered, his voice cracking over the hall like a whip. "Throw the thieving wretch in the deepest dungeon!" The armored guards drew their broadswords and lunged forward. Eve stood entirely paralyzed, the cold dread of the executioner's block freezing the blood in her veins as she waited for the end. The heavy, iron-shod boots of the royal guards thundered against the polished marble, the metallic rasp of broadswords clearing their scabbards, cutting through the horrified gasps of the nobility. Eve stood frozen in the center of the grand hall, her breath trapped in her throat. The blinding glare of the crystal chandeliers felt heavy, illuminating her like a condemned prisoner upon a scaffold. Lady Rowena stood a few paces away, her face twisted in a mask of triumphant, venomous glee. The trap had closed perfectly. But before the first guard could lay a gauntleted hand on Eve's severe green gown, a blur of royal blue velvet violently shattered the king's protocol. Bradley Stevens did not shout. He did not plead. He moved with the terrifying, lethal grace of a military commander entering a battlefield. He strode directly into the center of the grand hall and physically interposed his broad body between Eve and the advancing guards. The sheer, audacious authority radiating from the Duke of the Northern Reaches caused the heavily armed men to stagger to a halt, their swords wavering. Beneath the thousands of crystal prisms, the hall descended into a suffocating, absolute silence. No one breathed. To defy the king's direct order was madness. To do so for a plain, impoverished ward was unthinkable. Bradley didn't look at the guards, nor did he look at the sputtering, furious king. He turned his back to the entire glittering court and looked only at Eve. With infinite gentleness that directly contradicted the violence of the moment, he reached out and took her trembling hands. Right there, under the horrified gaze of the kingdom's most powerful aristocrats, he laced his fingers firmly through hers. He took the heavy gold signet ring from Rowena's outstretched, shaking hand, and with deliberate, undeniable finality, he slid it onto Eve's finger. Bradley slowly turned his head, his piercing gaze sweeping over the paralyzed court before locking onto the monarch. When he spoke, his voice boomed over the absolute silence of the hall, vibrating with a fierce, protective wrath. "This ring was not stolen," Bradley declared, the words striking the marble walls like cannon fire. "It was given freely, as a betrothal pledge to the only woman in this kingdom with the intellect and heart to rule by my side." Lady Rowena emitted a strangled, breathless noise, her black lace fan dropping from her limp fingers to clatter uselessly against the floor. King Alden's face flushed a dangerous, mottled crimson. He stepped forward on the dais, his voice trembling with royal fury. "You would defy the crown for a servant, Stevens? You would taint your noble bloodline with a commoner who wears dirt on her hands. Release her at once, or I will strip you of your royal favor, your trade routes, and your standing in this court." Bradley stood tall, staring down the monarch without a flicker of hesitation. He tightened his grip on Eve's hand, anchoring her, pulling her out of the shadows and firmly into the light. "Keep your favor, Your Majesty," Bradley replied, his tone dripping with an icy, devastating clarity. "You preside over a court that values silk over substance and paint over intellect. You boast of your wealth while your outer provinces starve. A crown of gold is useless to a starving man. My lands do not need another delicate ornament to sit in a tower. They need a savior. They need her." Without waiting for the king to dismiss him, Bradley turned. He led Eve straight down the center aisle of the grand hall. The sea of pastel gowns and powdered wigs parted wildly to let them through. They walked out of the suffocating glare of Ethelred Castle, leaving a breathless, utterly shattered social order in their wake, and a defeated Rowena collapsing into her gilded chair in ruined shock. The story, however, did not end at the heavy oak doors of the palace. 3 years later, the consequences of that night were carved directly into the earth. We flash forward to find Ethelred Castle, still a place of glittering gold and endless vanity, but the whispers in its corridors have grown fearful. The royal pantries are thinning, the surrounding fields are turning a brittle, chalky grey, and the people grumble with unhappy, hungry bellies. The king's pursuit of endless beauty had yielded a barren harvest. But a stark, breathtaking contrast lay in the northern reaches. The once dying province had been utterly transformed. Endless, sweeping mountain slopes were carved into brilliant, intricate Roman terraces, overflowing with golden wheat and deep green vines. The land was lush, thriving, and aggressively alive. Standing at the edge of a newly turned field was Eve. She was not dripping in diamonds, nor was she bound by the suffocating corsets of the southern court. She wore a simple, sturdy dress, the harsh northern wind whipping her dark hair around her face. There was a visible smudge of rich, dark soil on her cheek, and on her hand, glinting proudly in the unfiltered afternoon sun, was the heavy gold signet ring of the Duke. A few yards away, Bradley sat atop his dark warhorse, watching his Duchess. He did not look at her as a man looks at a pretty, decorative prize. He looked at her with the profound, unshakable reverence of a man looking at the savior of his world. They called her too plain for the palace, and they were right. She was not meant to be a decoration in a dying castle. She was meant to be the architect of a living world. Eve's story proves that true value is always found beneath the surface. I'm so curious where in the world this message reached you today. Drop your city or country down in the comments. And to help this community grow, please leave a like, share this tale with a fellow history lover, and ring that subscribe bell so you never miss our next journey.